My fiancé had his best friend write his wedding vows. I made him read them at the divorce. Jake and I had been together for 5 years when he proposed. It was perfect. He took me to the beach where we first met, got down on one knee at sunset, and said the most beautiful words about how I'd changed his life. He cried. I cried. Everyone on the beach clapped. He'd written this whole speech about how he'd loved me from the first moment and wanted to spend every day making me happy. I thought I was marrying the most romantic man alive. We planned the wedding for a year. I handled most of it because Jake said he trusted my vision. He just wanted to show up and marry me. He did pick his groomsmen, though. His best friend Adam was best man, obviously. They'd been friends since middle school. Adam was always around. Every date night turned into the three of us. Every vacation included Adam. Jake said I was being jealous when I asked for couple time. He said secure women didn't mind their man having friends. 2 months before the wedding, I was stressed about writing my vows. I'd written 12 drafts and nothing felt good enough. I wanted them to be perfect. Jake said he'd already finished his and I'd love them. He said he'd been working on them since the day we got engaged. That made me feel better. He was taking this seriously. The week before the wedding, Adam got drunk at the bachelor party and called me. He was laughing about how Jake owed him big time. I asked what he meant. He said writing wedding vows was harder than his college essays. I asked what he was talking about. He said Jake had paid him $500 to write the vows, because Jake said emotional stuff wasn't his thing. Adam thought it was hilarious that I'd be crying over words Jake didn't even write. I hung up and confronted Jake. He said Adam was drunk and joking. He showed me the vows on his phone and said he'd written every word. They were beautiful. All about our journey together, how I made him whole, how he couldn't wait for our future. He practiced reading them and got emotional. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. The wedding day came. 200 guests, a gorgeous venue, everything perfect. When it was time for vows, I went first. Poured my heart out about our love story, made everyone cry, meant every single word. Then Jake pulled out his phone. He said he wanted to get the words exactly right. He started reading and they were beautiful, but something felt off. The language didn't sound like Jake. He never used words like ethereal or serendipitous in real life. Then he stumbled over the word amalgamation and pronounced it wrong. Jake had a master's degree. He knew that word, unless he'd never seen it before. I looked at Adam. He was mouthing along with the words. He knew every single word of my wedding vows, the vows my husband was reading to me at our wedding. I kept smiling through the ceremony, but inside I was dying. My husband couldn't even write his own wedding vows. The most important words of our relationship, and he'd outsourced them like a work presentation. At the reception, people kept complimenting Jake on his beautiful vows. He accepted every compliment like he'd earned them. His mom cried, telling him she didn't know he was such a poet. His dad said he was proud Jake could express his feelings. Adam gave a best man speech about how Jake always knew what to say to get what he wanted. He actually winked at Jake when he said it. During our first dance, Jake whispered that he meant every word of the vows. I asked which words specifically. He couldn't remember a single line without looking at his phone. He'd memorized nothing because they meant nothing to him. They were just words Adam wrote for money. I found out more during the honeymoon. Jake hadn't written the proposal speech either. Adam wrote that too for $300. Every love letter Jake had ever given me came from Adam. Every romantic text that made me fall deeper in love. All Adam. Jake would just tell Adam the general idea and Adam would make it sound good. The birthday cards, the anniversary posts on social media, the poem he supposedly wrote when my dad died. All Adam. Jake had paid his best friend to be romantic for him our entire relationship. I confronted Adam on the last night of our honeymoon when Jake was passed out drunk, and he broke down crying, admitting he'd been in love with me since the day Jake introduced us, and every beautiful word he wrote was actually how he felt about me. He showed me his phone with 5 years of unsent messages to me, including one from that morning that said Jake had only married me because his trust fund required him to be married by 30 to inherit. When Jake woke up to find us talking, he saw Adam's phone in my hand, grabbed it, and threw it off the hotel balcony. But not before I'd already forwarded myself the recording Adam had secretly made of Jake explaining exactly how he planned to divorce me in 2 years, once the trust fund cleared. I locked myself in the bathroom and listened to Jake bang on the hotel room door for 20 minutes straight. He kept saying we needed to talk, that he could explain everything, that Adam was lying because he was jealous. I sat on the cold tile floor with my phone and played the recording 3 times to make sure it was real. Jake's voice came through clear as anything, telling Adam that marrying me was just a business move to get his trust fund, and he'd divorce me in 2 years once the money cleared. I opened my laptop and started forwarding everything to myself. The recording went to 3 different email accounts and my cloud storage. Then I went through every text message between Jake and Adam I could find on the evidence Adam had shown me before Jake threw his phone off the balcony. Screenshots of payment requests. Screenshots of Jake asking Adam to write anniversary messages. Screenshots of Jake literally copying and pasting Adam's words into text to me. I saved it all. Jake's knocking got louder and I heard him begging the hotel manager to open my door. A woman's voice told him she couldn't do that without my permission. I came out of the bathroom and told her through the door that I wanted to be moved to a different room on a different floor, and I didn't want my husband to know which one. She said she'd arrange it immediately. Jake started crying and saying he loved me. I asked him which words he wanted to use to tell me that. His words or Adam's words. He went quiet. The hotel manager came back 15 minutes later with a security guard. and they moved me to a room on the third floor while Jake wasn't looking. I ordered room service for dinner and breakfast and lunch the next day because I couldn't face going outside and possibly running into him. I spent 2 full days in that room going through 5 years of messages and emails and cards. Every single romantic thing Jake ever said to me had Adam's fingerprints all over it. The proposal speech had whole sentences that Adam had posted on his own Instagram months before Jake proposed. The poem Jake supposedly wrote when my dad died was actually a modified version of a poem Adam had written for a college class. I found the original on Adam's old blog. Everything was fake. Everything. On the flight home, I checked in online and changed my seat assignment to the front of the plane. Jake still had the seats we'd booked together near the back. I got to the airport early and went through security fast so I wouldn't have to see him at the gate. When I got on the plane, I put my headphones in and closed my eyes. About halfway through the flight, a flight attendant tapped my shoulder and handed me a folded napkin. She said the gentleman in seat 24B asked her to give it to me. I looked at the napkin and put it in the seat pocket without reading it. She came back 10 minutes later with another one. I did the same thing. By the time we landed, she'd brought me 6 napkins total and I hadn't read a single one. When we landed, I grabbed my carry-on and got off the plane before Jake could catch up with me. I took a taxi home even though we'd planned to share a ride. The apartment felt different when I walked in. Everything looked the same, but I couldn't stand being there knowing Jake would show up soon. He walked in about an hour after me and immediately started talking about how we needed to discuss things rationally. I told him he had exactly 1 hour to pack whatever he needed and get out. He said I was being crazy and overreacting. I pulled up the recording on my phone and hit play. His voice filled the apartment talking about the trust fund requirement and the divorce timeline. His face went completely white. He tried to grab my phone, but I pulled it back and told him I had copies everywhere, and if he touched me, I'd call the police. He started crying and saying Adam made all of that up, that Adam was in love with me and trying to destroy our marriage. I asked him why Adam would have a recording of him saying those exact words in his exact voice. He had no answer. He packed 2 suitcases and left. I changed the locks that same day, even though the lease had both our names on it. I figured he could sue me if he wanted, but I wasn't letting him back in. His mom started calling me around dinner time. I watched my phone light up over and over with her name. 17 calls in 3 hours. I didn't answer any of them. I texted Mia instead and told her I needed her. She asked what happened and I said I'd explain in person. She showed up 40 minutes later with an overnight bag and 2 bottles of wine. We sat on my couch and I told her everything from the beginning. The fake vows, the paid communications, Adam's confession, the trust fund, the recording, all of it. She didn't interrupt once. When I finished, she opened the first bottle of wine and poured us both huge glasses. She stayed with me for 4 days straight, sleeping on my couch and ordering takeout and letting me cry whenever I needed to. On day 3, we started going through everything Jake had ever given me. Every card, every letter, every printed out email he'd sent when we were long distance for a summer. Mia had always been good at writing analysis from her English degree, and she started pointing out patterns. Certain phrases Adam used, certain sentence structures. We pulled up Adam's social media and found the same phrases in his posts from years ago. The proposal speech had a whole paragraph that was almost word for word from a post Adam made about finding true love. It was dated 8 months before Jake proposed. We made a spreadsheet documenting everything. Mia's sister had gotten divorced 2 years ago and used an attorney named Freya McKay, who Mia said was tough and smart. I called Freya's office and got an appointment for the next week. I spent that whole week printing everything. The recording got transcribed and printed. Every text message got screenshotted and printed. Every email, every card, every social media post that matched Jake's supposed words. I showed up to Freya's office with a 3-inch binder of evidence. She was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, with sharp eyes and an expensive suit. She listened to my whole story without interrupting once. I played her the recording and watched her face get more serious with every word. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said this was one of the most clear-cut cases of fraud she'd ever seen. She explained that marrying someone under false pretenses, especially for financial gain, could constitute fraud and might even invalidate the marriage entirely. The trust fund angle made it particularly serious because it showed premeditated deception for monetary benefit. She said we could potentially argue for an annulment rather than a divorce, which would mean the marriage never legally existed at all. I asked what that would mean for Jake and his trust fund. She smiled and said that was his problem, not mine. 3 days after I met with Freya, someone knocked on my apartment door at 8 in the morning. I looked through the peephole and saw Jake's father Tristan standing there in a business suit. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. He said he wanted to talk about Jake and me and finding a path forward. I told him there was no path forward. He said Jake really did love me and just struggled with expressing emotions, that he'd always been that way since he was a boy. I asked Tristan if he knew about the trust fund requirement. He looked down at his shoes. That told me everything. I asked him again, directly, if he knew Jake had to be married by 30 to inherit. Tristan looked back up at me and said yes. The family had known about the requirement for years. He said they'd been relieved when Jake finally found someone to settle down with. He actually said someone nice like me, like I should be flattered they'd picked me as the convenient wife. I told him to leave and closed the door in his face. I called Freya's office the next morning and asked if she knew any good private investigators. She gave me 3 names and I picked the first one. A guy named Jeremy Carver who worked out of a small office downtown. I met him that afternoon and showed him everything I had. He looked through the trust fund recording twice and made notes on a yellow legal pad. He said he could verify the trust fund details and dig into Jake's financial history to see if there were more surprises hiding. It would cost me $1,500 for the basic investigation. I didn't hesitate. I needed to know exactly what I was dealing with. Jeremy called me 4 days later and asked me to come to his office. He had a manila folder on his desk that looked about 2 inches thick. He opened it and started pulling out bank statements with highlighted sections. The trust fund was real and it was worth over $3 million. Jake would get access to it 30 days after his 30th birthday, which Jeremy had calculated was in exactly 7 weeks from now. That explained why Jake had been so desperate to get married when he did. We'd been together for 5 years, but he suddenly proposed 8 months before his birthday and pushed for a short engagement. I'd thought he was just excited to marry me. Jeremy pulled out more papers and showed me something that made my stomach turn. He'd gotten Jake's bank records going back 5 years and found monthly payments to Adam ranging from $200 to $800. Every single one was labeled as consulting fees. Jeremy had added them all up. Over $30,000 spent on outsourcing our entire relationship. $30,000 to pay someone else to pretend Jake had feelings. I sat there staring at the numbers and felt completely numb. Jeremy asked if I was okay and I told him I was fine, which a lie. I took the folder and drove home in a fog. That night I got a notification on Instagram that someone had sent me a message request. It was Adam. I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity got the better of me. He'd written this long message about how he never meant to hurt me, and his feelings were real even if Jake's weren't. He said he'd been in love with me for 5 years and every word he wrote came from his heart. He said he knew I probably hated him, but he needed me to know the truth. I read it twice and then blocked him on Instagram. Then I went through Facebook, Twitter, and every other platform I could think of, and blocked him on all of them. I couldn't deal with his guilt on top of everything else I was processing. His feelings didn't matter anymore because he'd still helped Jake lie to me for 5 years. 3 days later, Freya called and said she'd filed for an annulment instead of a regular divorce. She explained that an annulment would mean the marriage never legally existed because it was based on fraud. I never would have married Jake if I'd known the truth about his motivations and deception. The trust fund recording made it clear this was fraud for financial gain. Freya said this was a stronger case than just filing for divorce, and it might actually affect whether Jake could inherit the money. I asked what she meant, and she said some trust funds have clauses about fraud or criminal activity. If the marriage was declared fraudulent, the trust administrators might decide Jake didn't actually meet the marriage requirement in good faith. 2 days after that, Freya called again. Jake's family had hired a lawyer who contacted her trying to negotiate. They were offering me a cash settlement to drop the annulment and just file for regular divorce instead. They were clearly worried about the trust fund. Freya said we should meet to discuss it. I went to her office the next morning and she had the settlement offer printed out. $50,000 to drop the annulment and quietly divorce. I could have the money within 2 weeks if I agreed to their terms. Freya leaned back in her chair and said we could probably push for more money if I wanted. But the more important question was what outcome I actually wanted. Did I want money, or did I want Jake to face consequences? I thought about it for maybe 10 seconds. I didn't just want money. I wanted Jake to understand that he couldn't buy his way out of what he'd done. I wanted his family to worry about their precious trust fund. I wanted actual consequences. I told Freya to proceed with the annulment and let them worry. She smiled and said she'd let their lawyer know we weren't interested in settling. The next week I was at work eating lunch in my car because I couldn't face the cafeteria, and Jake showed up in the parking lot. I saw him walking toward my car and locked the doors. He started knocking on my window and saying my name. People were staring. He was begging me to reconsider and saying we could work this out. I called the front desk and told them to send security to the parking lot. 2 security guards came out and had to physically walk Jake back to his car while he kept turning around and yelling that he loved me. My coworkers saw the whole thing. I was completely mortified. Everyone would know my marriage fell apart after 2 weeks. I couldn't even look at anyone when I went back inside. That night I couldn't sleep at all. I kept replaying everything and questioning every relationship I'd ever had. How could I trust my own judgment about people when I'd been so completely wrong about Jake? I called my insurance company the next morning and asked for a list of therapists. They gave me 5 names and I picked one named Ciara Reagan who had the first available appointment. I met with her 2 days later in a small office with comfortable chairs and boxes of tissues everywhere. I told her the whole story and cried through most of it. She listened without interrupting and then said something that actually helped. She said Jake's deception didn't mean I was stupid or that my feelings weren't real. My feelings were genuine even if his were fake. I'd loved the person I thought he was and that person never existed. But my love was still real. That wasn't my fault. During our second session, Kiara asked me what I was most angry about. I started to say the money or the fake vows, but then I stopped. That wasn't it. What made me furious was that Jake had stolen 5 years of my life where I could have been with someone who actually loved me. He took my 20s and used them as a placeholder until he could cash in. I could have met someone real. I could have had an actual relationship. Instead, I wasted 5 years being a checkbox on Jake's inheritance requirements. Those years were gone and I couldn't get them back. Jeremy called me 3 days later with something he'd found during his investigation. Adam had been seeing a therapist for years, and the court had subpoenaed those records as part of building our case. I met Jeremy at a coffee shop to go over what he'd discovered, and he spread out the documents on the table between us. The therapist's notes showed Adam had been struggling with his feelings for me since the day Jake introduced us. He'd gone to therapy specifically because he felt guilty about helping Jake lie to me, but couldn't make himself stop, because writing those words meant staying connected to me somehow. Every session note mentioned the same conflict over and over. He knew what he was doing was wrong, but he loved me, and being Jake's ghostwriter was the only way to be part of my life. The therapist had apparently suggested multiple times that Adam should tell me the truth or stop writing for Jake, but Adam always found reasons not to. Reading those notes made me feel sick, because it meant Adam had knowingly participated in deceiving me for 5 years, while fully understanding how wrong it was. Jeremy said this evidence would be powerful in court, because it showed the deception wasn't just careless, it was calculated and sustained over a long period, despite Adam's own therapist telling him to stop. The next major development came when Roman got deposed for the case. Roman was the administrator of Jake's trust fund, and Freya had him brought in to testify about the marriage requirement. I sat in on the deposition through a video call, watching as Freya questioned him about the terms of the trust. Roman explained that Jake's grandfather had set up the trust with specific requirements designed to ensure Jake settled down and took responsibility for his life. The marriage requirement was supposed to encourage Jake to find a partner and build a stable life before getting access to millions of dollars. Roman actually seemed uncomfortable as he talked about it, like he understood the irony of what had happened. Freya asked him directly if the trust creators had intended for Jake to marry someone under false pretenses purely to meet a deadline. Roman said no. The intent was for Jake to genuinely commit to another person and demonstrate maturity. The whole point was to make sure Jake wasn't just a rich kid wasting money, but instead had a partner to share his life with. Freya thanked him and ended the deposition, then called me afterward to say his testimony was perfect because it showed Jake had completely missed the point of the requirement. Jake had treated marriage as just another box to check off, exactly the opposite of what his grandfather wanted. That same week, Jake's mom finally got through to me on the phone. I'd been ignoring her calls, but she called from a number I didn't recognize and I answered without thinking. She started in immediately, telling me I was being selfish and vindictive by pursuing the annulment. She said every marriage has problems and I was throwing away a good man over communication issues. I actually laughed out loud at that, which made her angrier. She raised her voice and said I was being dramatic and immature, that marriage takes work, and I was giving up at the first sign of trouble. She told me Jake was devastated and losing weight and couldn't sleep, and it was my fault for refusing to forgive him. She said his father had taught him that actions matter more than words, and Jake had shown through his actions that he cared about me by staying faithful and providing for me. I let her finish her whole speech before I responded. I told her that her son had paid another man to pretend to love me for 5 years, so he could inherit money. I said if she thought that was just a communication issue, then I understood exactly where Jake had learned his values. I explained that Jake had treated me like a business transaction, that he'd calculated exactly how much money he needed to spend on fake romance to get access to his trust fund. I asked her if she would have wanted Jake's father to outsource every romantic moment of their relationship to a paid writer. I asked if she'd be okay with finding out her entire marriage was based on someone else's words and feelings. She went silent for a few seconds, then said I was twisting everything to make Jake look bad. She said I was being cruel and unreasonable. Then she hung up on me. I sat there holding my phone and realized that Jake's whole family was exactly like him. They cared more about appearances and money than actual honesty or real feelings. Mia showed up at my apartment that weekend and announced she was taking me out. I told her I wasn't ready to go anywhere, but she said I'd been hiding for weeks and needed to leave the apartment before I went crazy. She picked out clothes for me while I protested, then physically pushed me toward the shower. An hour later, we were at our favorite bar, the one we used to go to in college. It felt weird being back there after everything that had happened, but Mia ordered us drinks and made me laugh with stories about her terrible dates from the past month. For a few hours, I actually felt almost normal, like maybe I could have a life after all this. We were on our third round when a couple at the table next to us started making a scene. The guy got down on one knee and pulled out a ring, giving this whole speech about how she was his soulmate and he wanted to spend forever with her. Everyone in the bar started clapping and cheering. The woman was crying and saying yes over and over. I watched them kiss and hug and suddenly I couldn't breathe. I remembered Jake's proposal on the beach, the beautiful words he'd said that weren't his, the way everyone had clapped for us too. I stood up so fast I knocked my chair over. Mia grabbed my arm and asked if I was okay, but I was already heading for the door. I made it outside before I started crying. Mia followed me out and hugged me while I sobbed on the sidewalk. She didn't say anything, just held me until I could breathe again. Then she drove me home and stayed over and we watched stupid movies until I fell asleep. Freya called me Monday morning with news about the hearing date. The annulment hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out, which she said was actually cutting it pretty close to Jake's 30th birthday. She explained that the timing might actually work in our favor because it would show how calculated everything was. If we could get the annulment finalized before Jake's birthday, it would be clear that he'd rushed into marriage specifically to meet the trust fund deadline. Freya said the judge would see that Jake had treated marriage as a business deadline rather than a life commitment. The hearing date was exactly 5 days before Jake turned 30, which meant if things went our way, Jake would technically still be married on his birthday, but the annulment would invalidate the marriage retroactively. Freya wasn't sure how that would affect the trust fund, but she said it wasn't our problem. Our job was to prove fraud, and the trust fund administrators could figure out the rest. Jeremy called again a few days later with another witness. Adam's roommate had contacted him and offered to testify about what he'd observed over the years. The roommate said Adam would come home from writing sessions with Jake, and complained constantly about having to write romantic things for someone who didn't appreciate them. Adam apparently would spend hours crafting the perfect message, then Jake would just copy and paste it without even reading it carefully. The roommate said Adam would get angry about it, saying he was putting his heart into these words and Jake treated them like grocery lists. This testimony was important because it established the pattern of deception and showed that other people knew what was happening. It also proved that Adam was aware his words meant something real, even if Jake wasn't. Jeremy said the roommate seemed eager to testify, like he'd been waiting for someone to ask. He'd apparently told Adam multiple times to stop helping Jake, but Adam couldn't make himself quit. I decided to go through our wedding photos one afternoon when I was alone in the apartment. I'd been avoiding them since everything happened, but I needed to see if there were signs I'd missed. I opened the album and started looking at each picture carefully. What I saw made my stomach hurt. In almost every photo, Adam was looking at me. Not just glancing, but really watching me with this expression I'd never noticed before. In the ceremony photos, he's staring at me while I'm saying my vows. In the reception photos, he's watching me dance with Jake. In the group shots, everyone else is looking at the camera, but Adam's eyes are on me. Meanwhile, Jake is looking at his phone in half the pictures. In our first dance photo, Jake is checking his watch. In the cake-cutting photo, Jake is looking past me at something else. It was like seeing a completely different story than the one I thought I'd lived. The wedding I remembered was about me and Jake starting our life together. But the photos showed Adam loving me while Jake counted down the time until he could check marriage off his list. I closed the album and put it in a box in the closet because I couldn't look at it anymore. Jake sent me a letter the following week. It arrived in a thick envelope with my name written in his actual handwriting. Inside was 50 pages of notebook paper covered in Jake's messy writing. The letter was him begging for another chance and trying to explain how he really did love me, but just wasn't good with words. He wrote about how he'd always struggled to express feelings, and that's why he'd asked Adam for help. He said his feelings were real even if the words weren't his own. He wrote that he'd meant everything Adam had written, because Adam understood what Jake felt, but couldn't say. The letter went on, repeating the same ideas in different ways. I read the whole thing even though it made me angry. When I finished, I called Freya and told her about it. She said we should have it analyzed to make sure Jake actually wrote it himself this time. She sent it to a handwriting expert who confirmed it was definitely Jake's writing. Freya said that proved at least Jake was trying. But I told her it was too little too late. Jake had 5 years to write his own words to me, and he never bothered until after I left him. The letter itself was painful to read for a different reason than I expected. It was full of spelling mistakes and awkward sentences. Words were used wrong, like he'd tried to sound smart but didn't actually know what the words meant. Sentences would start one way and end completely different, like he lost track of what he was trying to say. Reading Jake's actual writing made me realize just how big the difference was between his words and Adam's. Every beautiful thing I'd thought came from Jake's heart was actually Adam's careful writing and genuine feeling. The real Jake could barely put together a clear paragraph. He'd written 50 pages, and I still didn't know what he was actually trying to say because his thoughts were so jumbled and unclear. This was the person I'd married, someone who couldn't even write a coherent love letter without help. I put the letter in the evidence box with everything else and tried not to think about how completely I'd been fooled. I started going through the apartment the next Saturday morning, pulling Jake's gifts out of drawers and closets. The necklace he gave me for our first anniversary sat in its velvet box on the dresser. I picked it up and remembered crying when he gave it to me, thinking it meant he really understood how much I loved vintage jewelry. Now I knew Adam probably picked it out or at least told Jake what to buy. I dropped it back in the box and moved to the closet where Jake's birthday presents to me were stacked on a shelf. 5 years of carefully chosen gifts that I thought showed how well he knew me. A first edition book of my favorite novel. Concert tickets to bands I loved. A painting from an artist I mentioned once in passing. Every single one probably came from Adam's suggestions or research. I pulled everything down and started making piles on the living room floor. Mia showed up around noon with coffee and took one look at the mess covering every surface. She set down the cups and started helping me sort without saying anything. We worked in silence for over an hour, creating a donation pile that grew bigger and bigger. The only things Mia set aside were the expensive jewelry pieces. She held up the diamond earrings Jake gave me last Christmas and raised an eyebrow. I shook my head, but she insisted, saying Freya told her to make sure I kept anything valuable for the settlement talks. By late afternoon, we had loaded 3 boxes into Mia's car to drop at the donation center. The apartment looked emptier but cleaner somehow, like I was washing away the fake parts of my life. My phone rang while we were taping up the last box, and I saw Freya's name on the screen. She got right to the point when I answered. Jake's family lawyer had called her that morning with a new settlement offer. $150,000 if I agreed to switch from the annulment to a regular divorce and sign something called an NDA about everything that happened. Freya explained that meant I couldn't tell anyone about the trust fund or the paid communications or any of it. I asked what she thought, and she said the increased offer meant they were getting nervous. Jake's 30th birthday was only 5 weeks away, and they needed this resolved before then. The trust fund had specific timing requirements, and an annulment based on fraud could mess up the whole inheritance if it wasn't finalized in time. I told Freya I needed to think about it and hung up. Mia asked what was wrong, and I explained the offer while we drove to the donation center. She stayed quiet until we pulled into the parking lot, then turned to me and asked what I actually wanted out of all this. I sat there watching people carry boxes inside and realized I didn't know anymore. The money would be nice. I could pay off my student loans and maybe put a down payment on my own place. Internet. I could be done with all of this and move on with my life. But then I remembered sitting in my apartment with Tristan while he talked about how they were relieved Jake found someone nice like me. Like I was just a solution to their problem instead of a person. Like any decent woman would have worked as long as she agreed to marry Jake before his birthday. I pulled out my phone and called Freya back. When she answered, I told her we weren't settling. She asked if I was sure, and I said yes. Whatever happened next, I wasn't going to let them pay me to stay quiet about what Jake did. Jeremy called me 3 days later, sounding excited. He'd been doing background research on Jake like Freya asked and found something interesting. Jake had profiles on 2 different dating apps, and Jeremy managed to get screenshots from a friend who matched with him. In the profile, Jake said he was separated and going through a divorce from his crazy wife who couldn't handle him having close friendships. He told women I was jealous and controlling, that I tried to keep him away from his best friend, that I overreacted to normal guy behavior. Jeremy said he had messages where Jake told multiple women that I invented problems in our marriage because I was insecure. I asked Jeremy to send everything to Freya and add it to our evidence file. After I hung up, I sat on my couch feeling sick. Jake was already rewriting history and making me the bad guy in his story. He was probably telling everyone who would listen that I was unreasonable and that our marriage ended because of my issues. None of his friends would ever know the truth about what he did or why I left. My therapy appointment with Ciara was that Thursday afternoon. I'd been seeing her for 3 weeks and we'd mostly talked about the trust issues and how to process everything with Jake. But this session I told her about Adam and realized while I was talking that I might actually be angrier at him than at Jake. Ciara asked me to explain what I meant. I said Jake was selfish and lazy and took the easy way out of everything, so in some ways his behavior made sense even if it was terrible. But Adam knew exactly what he was doing. He wrote those beautiful words knowing I would fall in love with them. He watched me cry over letters he wrote while pretending to be happy for me and Jake. He came to our wedding and gave a speech about friendship while knowing the groom didn't even write his own vows. Adam had 5 years to tell me the truth, or to stop helping Jake lie to me, and he chose to keep going. He chose to watch me fall deeper in love with words that came from his heart, but were delivered by someone who didn't mean them. Ciara pointed out that Adam's feelings for me probably made it more complicated for him. I said that actually made it worse because it meant he used his real emotions to manipulate me through Jake. Every beautiful sentence was Adam's genuine feeling that I could never have because he was too busy helping Jake trick me. Ciara suggested that maybe Adam thought helping Jake was the only way to stay close to me. I told her that didn't make it better. It made it more twisted and selfish. By the time I left her office, I felt exhausted from talking about it, but also clearer about why Adam's betrayal hurt so much. Freya emailed me the next morning with an attachment from the honeymoon hotel. They'd found the security footage from the balcony incident and sent it over. I downloaded the video file and watched Jake grab Adam's phone out of my hand, walk to the balcony, and throw it over the railing. The whole thing took maybe 15 seconds, but you could see Jake's face clearly. He wasn't drunk or confused. He knew exactly what he was doing. Freya called right after I finished watching and said this was huge for our case. The footage showed something called consciousness of guilt, which meant Jake knew he did something wrong and was trying to destroy evidence of it. A judge would see this and understand that Jake threw the phone because he didn't want anyone to see what was on it. The premeditation was obvious from how quickly and deliberately he acted. Freya sounded more excited than I'd heard her since we started working together. She said this single piece of evidence could make the difference in getting the annulment approved, because it proved Jake knew his marriage was based on lies worth hiding. 3 weeks before our scheduled hearing date, Freya called to tell me Jake's lawyer had requested mediation. She explained this was pretty normal in divorce cases, and it meant we'd sit down with a neutral third party to try to work things out before going to court. I asked if we had to do it, and she said no, but she actually thought we should. Mediation could be useful strategically because it would give us a chance to see what Jake's side was planning to argue. We could also use it to show we tried to settle reasonably, which would look good to a judge if we ended up in court anyway. But Freya warned me that mediation would be brutal emotionally, because I'd have to sit in the same room with Jake and hear him try to justify everything he did. I'd have to stay calm while his lawyer painted me as unreasonable or vindictive. She said it was completely up to me, but she wanted me to know what I'd be walking into. I told her I needed a day to think about it. That night I called Mia and explained the whole thing. She listened quietly and then said she'd come wait in the lobby during the mediation if I decided to do it. She said I wouldn't be alone even if I had to go into that room by myself. I called Freya the next morning and told her I'd do the mediation. She scheduled it for 2 weeks out and said she'd prepare me for what to expect. The night before mediation, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about seeing Jake face to face and what I would say if he tried to apologize again. Around 2 in the morning, I got up and opened my laptop to look through the evidence files Freya had organized for our case. I found the folder with Adam's unsent messages and started reading through them even though I knew it would make me feel worse. The messages went back 5 years to right after Jake first introduced us. Adam wrote about how he couldn't stop thinking about me after we met, how he wished Jake would mess up so he could have a chance, how he hated himself for helping Jake because it meant watching me fall for someone else. The messages got more detailed over time. Adam wrote about specific moments from our relationship, like my birthday dinner where Jake gave me that first edition book. Adam's message from that night said he'd spent 3 hours at 5 different bookstores finding the perfect copy, and Jake never even thanked him. Another message was from the night Jake proposed. Adam wrote that he'd edited the proposal speech 17 times to get it perfect, and then had to watch Jake deliver his words while I cried happy tears. The most recent messages were from our wedding week. Adam wrote about how beautiful I looked at the rehearsal dinner, how he almost told me the truth a dozen times but couldn't do it, how he knew I'd hate him after I found out, but at least he'd finally be free of the secret. The last message was from our wedding day, written hours after the ceremony. Adam said watching me marry Jake while reading his vows was the worst moment of his life. He said he'd ruined any chance of us ever being together by staying silent for so long. He said he deserved whatever happened next. I closed the laptop feeling sick and angry and sad all at once. I couldn't even trust whether Adam's feelings were real, or if he'd convinced himself he loved me as justification for his role in Jake's lies. Maybe Adam just liked the drama of secret feelings and unrequited love. Maybe he liked having power over our relationship by controlling the words Jake used. I'd never know the truth about Adam's motivations, and that uncertainty made everything worse. The mediation was scheduled for 10 in the morning at a law office downtown. Mia drove me there and came inside to wait in the lobby like she promised. Freya met me in the hallway and we went over last-minute instructions. She reminded me to stay calm no matter what Jake said, to let her do most of the talking, to not engage directly with Jake unless the mediator specifically asked me a question. She squeezed my shoulder and said I could do this. We walked into the conference room and I saw Jake sitting on the other side of the table with his lawyer. He looked terrible. His face was pale and he had dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in weeks. His hair was messy and he'd lost weight. Part of me felt satisfied seeing him suffer because it meant this actually affected him. But mostly I just felt empty and tired, like I'd used up all my emotional energy and had nothing left. Side note, Alexander settled into his chair at the head of the table and opened a leather folder. He explained how mediation worked and said we'd each have a chance to share our side. Before he even finished talking, Jake's face crumpled and tears started rolling down his cheeks. He said he never meant to hurt me. He said he just panicked when it came to expressing feelings and made some bad choices. His voice shook and he wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He said he loved me and always had. His lawyer passed him a tissue and he blew his nose. I sat perfectly still watching him perform this show of emotion. Alexander turned to me and asked if I wanted to respond. I took a breath and kept my voice steady. I laid out the facts one by one. Jake paid Adam to write every romantic communication in our 5-year relationship. The proposal speech cost $300. The wedding vows cost $500. Birthday cards, anniversary messages, love letters, all purchased. I explained about the trust fund requirement that Jake had to be married by 30 to inherit over $3 million. I mentioned Jake's 30th birthday was in 7 weeks. I described how Jake threw Adam's phone off a balcony to destroy evidence. Alexander's face changed as I talked. His professional calm slipped and he looked uncomfortable. He kept glancing at Jake like he was trying to figure out what kind of person does something like this. Freya opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of documents. She laid the recording device on the table first. She explained this was Jake telling Adam his plan to divorce me in 2 years once the trust fund cleared. She showed bank statements with highlighted transfers to Adam labeled as consulting fees, $30,000 over 5 years. She presented the trust fund documents with the marriage requirement circled in red. Jake's lawyer jumped in saying that feelings can grow over time. He argued that maybe Jake's intentions started one way, but evolved into real love. Freya pulled out a calendar showing Jake proposed exactly 18 months before his 30th birthday. She showed how that timeline gave him enough time to plan a wedding and be safely married before the deadline. The trust fund timeline destroyed any argument about evolving feelings. I looked directly at Jake for the first time since we sat down. I asked him when he was planning to divorce me. He shook his head and said he never planned to divorce me at all. He said the recording was taken out of context. He said Adam misunderstood what he meant. Freya picked up the recording device and pressed play. Jake's voice came through the speaker clear and steady. He told Adam that he'd give the marriage 2 years to make it look real. He said once the trust fund cleared and he had control of the money, he'd file for divorce citing incompatibility. He said 2 years was long enough that no one would question it. The recording played in the silent conference room and Jake's face went white. His lawyer closed his eyes. Jake had no response because there was nothing to say. His own words condemned him. Alexander suggested we take a 15-minute break. Everyone started standing up and Jake moved toward me. Freya stepped directly between us before he got close. Jake looked at me over Freya's shoulder and said he missed me. He said he wanted to work things out. He asked if we could talk privately, like I was supposed to forget everything and go back to being his convenient wife. Like 5 years of lies could be fixed with a private conversation. Freya told Jake to step back and he did. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder and guided him toward the door. They left the conference room and I heard their voices in the hallway. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Mia sent a text asking how I was holding up. I texted back that I was okay. I realized I actually meant it. Seeing Jake in person should have wrecked me. Hearing his weak excuses should have made me doubt myself. But instead I felt calm and clear. Every word out of his mouth just confirmed that leaving was the right choice. The crying, the claims of love, the request to work things out, all of it was just more manipulation. More words that meant nothing. I put my phone away and looked at Freya. She asked if I was ready to go back in. I nodded. We walked back into the conference room and everyone took their seats. Alexander asked if we were ready to continue. I said I had a request. I told Alexander I wanted Jake to read his wedding vows out loud, the ones Adam actually wrote. Jake's lawyer immediately objected. He said this was unnecessarily cruel and served no purpose. Alexander looked at me and asked why this was relevant. I explained that understanding the emotional harm required understanding the depth of the deception. These weren't just any words. They were wedding vows, the most important promises of our relationship, and they were purchased. Alexander thought for a moment, then said, if it was relevant to understanding the emotional harm, he'd allow it. Jake said no. He said he wasn't going to do it. His lawyer leaned over and whispered something to him. Freya spoke up calmly. She said if we went to court, we had recordings of Jake practicing the vows with Adam. We had emails discussing word choices and edits. We had the payment records. She said we'd play all of it in front of a judge anyway. She suggested he might as well cooperate now. Jake's hands started shaking. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his files. His fingers trembled as he found the document. Jake started reading and his voice cracked on the first sentence. He read about how I was his soulmate and his best friend. He read about eternal love and unbreakable bonds. He read about how our souls recognized each other the moment we met. Every word was beautiful and romantic and completely fake. I listened to Adam's carefully crafted phrases coming out of Jake's mouth. Jake stumbled over certain words and had to start sentences over. His voice kept breaking. I watched him struggle through paragraphs about devotion and partnership and growing old together. I felt absolutely nothing except relief that I was getting out. This was the closure I didn't know I needed. Hearing the truth behind every sentence, knowing exactly what these words cost and who really wrote them. Jake could barely finish. The last line was about choosing me every day for the rest of his life. His voice was barely a whisper by the end. Complete silence filled the room after Jake stopped reading. No one moved or spoke. Even Jake's own lawyer looked disgusted. He stared down at his legal pad like he couldn't bear to look at his client. Alexander cleared his throat. He said quietly that in 20 years of mediation, this was one of the most clear-cut cases of fraudulent inducement to marriage he'd encountered. He said the evidence was overwhelming. The intent was documented. The deception was systematic and calculated. He looked at Jake and said, this wasn't about poor communication skills or emotional struggles. This was fraud. Jake's lawyer asked for a private conference with his client. They left the room and everyone just sat there in silence. I stared at the table and tried to keep my hands from shaking. Freya leaned over and whispered that this was good, that they were panicking. I nodded but didn't say anything. I couldn't believe this was actually happening. 20 minutes later, they came back in, and Jake looked like he'd been crying. His lawyer sat down and cleared his throat. He said his client was willing to agree to the annulment. Jake would pay me $200,000 and cover all my legal fees. There would be no NDA. I looked at Freya and she squeezed my hand under the table. She asked them to repeat the terms for the record. Jake's lawyer went through everything again while Jake just stared at his hands. The settlement got drafted right there in the mediation room. Someone brought in a laptop and started typing up the agreement. It took an hour to get all the language right and make sure everything was included. Jake sat there the whole time looking miserable while his lawyer reviewed each section. When the final version was ready, they printed it out and everyone had to initial every single page. I watched Jake sign his name over and over, 12 pages total. His hand was shaking. So bad his signature looked different on each page. He had to initial the part about the $200,000. He had to initial the part about admitting to fraud. He had to initial the part about the annulment being based on his deception. Every page was another reminder that he'd lost everything. The trust fund money he'd inherit would still be $3 million, but now with a huge chunk going to me. I felt nothing watching him sign away his perfect plan. We finished signing everything and stood up to leave. Jake tried to approach me one last time in the hallway outside the mediation room. His lawyer had already left, and it was just him standing there looking pathetic. He said he was sorry and that he really did develop feelings for me over time. He said the relationship became real for him even if it didn't start that way. I looked at him and felt absolutely nothing except tired. I told him he had no idea what real feelings even were. I said I hoped someday he'd figure out that people weren't just tools to get what he wanted. Then I walked away with Freya and didn't look back. I heard him call my name, but I kept walking. 2 days later, I got a text from a mutual friend asking if I'd gotten Adam's message. I said I hadn't gotten anything from Adam. She said he'd asked her to pass something along because I'd blocked him everywhere. She forwarded me his message. He said he was moving to another state for a fresh start. He wanted me to know he was sorry for everything. He said he understood if I never forgave him, but he needed me to know his feelings were always real. I read it twice and then deleted it without responding. His apology meant nothing when he'd watched me marry Jake knowing it was all a lie. He could have stopped it at any point during those 5 years. He could have told me the truth before the wedding. Instead, he took Jake's money and wrote beautiful words while I fell in love with a ghost. I didn't owe him closure or forgiveness or anything else. The annulment got finalized 2 weeks later. Freya called me on a Tuesday morning to tell me the judge had signed everything. She said it was official now. The marriage was legally void like it never happened. I asked about Jake's trust fund, and she said he'd still get access since he was technically married by his 30th birthday, which was in 3 days. But the fraud finding was on the public record for anyone to see. I thanked her for everything and hung up. Then I just sat on my couch for a while trying to process that my marriage was erased. 5 years of my life with Jake, and a 2-week marriage that legally never existed. I went to the courthouse the next day to file for my name change. The clerk handed me forms and I filled them out right there at the counter. I was going back to my maiden name. Every signature felt like reclaiming something Jake had tried to take from me. The clerk stamped the forms and said it would be official in a few days. I walked out of that courthouse feeling lighter than I had in months. Over the next week, I updated everything. My driver's license, my credit cards, my work email, my social media. Every document that got changed felt like erasing Jake from my life. I started introducing myself with my real name again, and it felt right in a way nothing had felt right since the honeymoon. Mia threw me an annulment party the following weekend. She decorated her apartment with balloons and invited all our friends. Everyone brought gifts for my fresh start. Someone gave me a set of wine glasses. Someone else brought me a plant for my new place. Then Mia handed me a wrapped package and told me to open it last. Inside was a journal with "Write Your Own Story" embossed on the cover in gold letters. I actually laughed for the first time in months. Everyone cheered and we drank too much wine, and I felt genuinely happy surrounded by people who actually cared about me. I started apartment hunting the next week. I needed my own space, somewhere that had nothing to do with Jake. I found a one-bedroom about 20 minutes from work. It was small, but it was mine. I'd never lived alone before, going straight from college roommates to living with Jake. I signed the lease and got the keys and stood in the empty apartment feeling incredibly powerful. No one else had keys to this place. No one could just walk in. This space belonged only to me, and I could make it into whatever I wanted. I kept seeing Tiara every week for therapy. She helped me work through everything and recognize all the red flags I'd missed. I told her about how Jake always avoided deep conversations, how he'd changed the subject whenever I tried to talk about feelings, how he never wanted to meet my family alone, always bringing Adam along. She helped me see that I'd ignored so many warning signs because I wanted to believe in the fairy tale. I wanted to believe that Jake's beautiful words meant he was the perfect man. I was learning to trust my instincts again, and not ignore problems just because someone said the right things. 3 months after the annulment, I ran into one of Jake's groomsmen at a coffee shop. I was ordering my usual when I heard someone say my name. I turned around, and there was Dennis, who'd been one of Jake's groomsmen at the wedding. He looked uncomfortable, but came over anyway. He said he'd heard about everything and wanted me to know most of the groomsmen thought Jake was an idiot. Then he told me something I hadn't expected. He said Jake and Adam weren't friends anymore. Apparently, Jake blamed Adam for everything falling apart. He'd told people that Adam sabotaged his marriage because Adam was jealous. Dennis said it was typical Jake refusing to take any responsibility for his own actions. I thanked him for telling me and left with my coffee. I wasn't surprised that Jake couldn't even own up to what he'd done. He'd probably convinced himself by now that he was the victim in all of this. I downloaded a dating app a few weeks later and filled out my profile honestly. I wrote that I was recently out of a marriage and not looking for anything serious, just casual dates and good conversation. The first guy I met for coffee talked about his job for 40 minutes straight without asking me a single question. The second one spent the whole time complaining about his ex. The third guy seemed nice enough until he asked if I wanted to come back to his place after 20 minutes. I deleted the app and told Mia I wasn't ready for this yet. She said that was okay, and suggested we focus on just having fun instead of forcing anything. We started going to trivia nights at a bar near her place, and I actually laughed without thinking about Jake for hours at a time. My bank account showed a new deposit one morning while I was getting coffee. $200,000 just sitting there with a reference number from Jake's lawyer. I stared at my phone screen for a full minute trying to process that this money was real and mine. I paid off my student loans that same day, watching the balance drop to zero after years of monthly payments. Then I called a realtor and started looking at condos in neighborhoods I actually wanted to live in, not places Jake had picked because they were close to his parents. I found a small 2-bedroom with big windows and a balcony, put down 20% and signed the papers within 3 weeks. The rest of the settlement money went into a high-yield savings account for my future, whatever that looked like. Mia booked us flights to Hawaii 2 months later, saying we both needed a real vacation after everything. We stayed at a resort on Maui and spent our days on the beach drinking fruity cocktails and our nights dancing at hotel bars. One night we got so drunk we tried to convince the bartender to teach us how to make Mai Tais and ended up spilling rum all over the bar. We laughed so hard I couldn't breathe, and I realized I felt genuinely happy for the first time since before Jake proposed on that beach 5 years ago. This was what a honeymoon should have felt like, surrounded by someone who actually cared about me and wanted me to be happy. 6 months had passed since Adam threw his phone off that balcony, and my whole life fell apart. I was living in my own condo with furniture I picked out myself and a mortgage in only my name. I'd started seeing someone new named Clark who worked at the gym I joined. His texts were sometimes awkward, and he definitely wasn't a poet. But everything he said to me came from him, and that mattered more than perfect words ever could. We went on actual dates where he asked me questions and remembered my answers. He wrote me a birthday card in his own messy handwriting with spelling mistakes, and it meant more to me than every beautiful letter Adam had ghostwritten for Jake. I'd learned that pretty words without real feeling behind them were just empty sounds, and I only wanted the real thing now, even if it was clumsy and imperfect.